This section here, oh, it's going to be hard. It's going to be so hard. I miss my microphone. I miss it so much. I could talk over everybody. It was so good. This section here, there's going to be no computers. So if you want to use your computer, just find another spot. So we'll see how that works. People let me know if that's working out for them. But that's what we're going to do, that section. So we're doing the Phillips curve. And where did we get? We got the quantity theory of money. So if we believe that velocity, at least in the long run, is rather constant, and y in the long run is constant, then any changes in the money supply are going to be reflected in prices. And more or less everyone agrees that this happens in the long run. People disagree about how long it takes for that to happen. Some people think it happens very quickly, some people more slowly. But the important thing here is that if you can control the money supply, you can, at least in the long run, control prices. Right? If you print more money, prices are going to be higher. If you print less money, prices are going to be lower. At least in the long run. Debates about how that happens, how long it takes to happen. Okay. So here we've got our Phillips curve. This is the empirical relationship drawn out neat and clean. So when inflation is high, you have low unemployment. When inflation is low, you have high unemployment. Right? So now that we've left the gold standard, right? Before, in the gold standard, you really couldn't change the money supply. I mean, it changed sometimes just because, people discovered gold somewhere or foreigners brought in a lot of gold. So it did vary year to year, but it wasn't something that you could really control. You couldn't sit out and say, I want the money supply higher. I want the money supply lower. You were kind of stuck with whatever it was. Right? And that's where all this data came from a world where the money supply changed, but not under anyone's control. But now after 1971, now we can control the money supply and we can think, hey, I can control the money supply. That's going to change inflation. If I want, I can have high inflation and I will have low unemployment. Or if I want, I can have low inflation just by not printing money and I'm going to have high unemployment. And I get to choose as a policymaker where on this Phillips curve I want to be. Glorious, a whole new world of things that we can do to try to make the world a better place. And in particular, everyone said, wouldn't it be nice if unemployment was lower? Because unemployment really sucks. We don't want unemployment. Maybe we're willing to accept a little bit of inflation in order to get rid of unemployment. Right? Seems plausible. Okay. But what happened in real life? Well, it didn't work out that way. And we saw the graph last time. Where was it? Yeah. Right, this is after 1971. So that Phillips curve thing just disappeared. So we want to understand why that is. So we now have the shifts in the Phillips curve, which we talked about. And everyone dizzy now by all the flipping slides? Yes, very dizzy. No clue what's going on. They're coming and they're going. Okay, here's our Phillips curve. All right, back where we were. Okay, so now, why did it disappear? Well, if we think about what was going on is in the gold standard world, everyone still had to predict the price level, right? They had to predict unemployment to set their wages. And that was going to determine which Phillips curve we were on. And when they were doing that, presumably they were pretty sophisticated. Is it a good year? Is it a bad year? How is my industry doing? Are we at war? Aren't we at war? What are our business conditions? They used all kinds of things. But one thing they didn't have to worry about was, what is the central bank going to do with the money supply? They had to worry about, will they find gold in California? Right, and all this gold will come in, or going back even further, will the Spanish and the Portuguese take all the gold out of Central America and bring it over here and change the money supply? They had to worry about that kind of thing, but not whether they're just going to, on a whim, increase the money supply, decrease the money supply. They didn't have to worry about that because the policymakers couldn't do that. right? And so they set their expectations of inflation based on what they thought market conditions were like and how the industries were doing and how the country was doing and all that sort of stuff. But they didn't worry about the money supply. Okay? However, once the central bank has the ability to change the money supply, and they know about this Phillips curve. Everybody knows about this Phillips curve. Mr. Phillips and all his minions, they were whacking on about this thing for decades. Everyone knows this Phillips curve exists. Everyone knows that the central bank knows that this Phillips curve exists. And so they have to say, well, not only do I have to predict business conditions, but now, for the first time, I have to predict what the central bank is going to do with the money supply. Before, I didn't have to do that because they couldn't do anything with the money supply. But now they can, and they've got this trade-off, and you might think, well, maybe they're going to raise inflation a little bit to get unemployment lower, something that they weren't doing before. Right? So now there's an extra reason to have higher inflation. Right? So people are naturally going to start thinking, well, if we have this Phillips curve, the central bank is going to exploit it by increasing the money supply, increasing the price level, so as to get unemployment low. So when I'm setting my wages, I better take that into account. I have to take the policymaker's behavior into account when I'm setting my expectations of inflation, something I didn't have to do before. Okay. And since we think that the policymaker is probably going to try to lower unemployment, this means that I'm going to have higher expected inflation than I did before. So this Phillips curve is going to shift up. Okay. And so this Phillips curve existed because we thought, well, we just tried to predict market conditions, and then sometimes money supply was high, sometimes low. But now that we can try to exploit it, people set higher expected inflation, they demand higher wage increases, and the whole Phillips curve shifts up. So the fact that we are trying to exploit this empirical relationship is actually going to cause it to disappear. So a very good empirical relationship, but as soon as we try to use it, poof, it's gone. Okay. And this is the Lucas critique. Well, this is an example of the Lucas critique. Robert E. Lucas Jr., giant in economics, macroeconomics. I told you about Lucas last time. Right? I can't remember which classes I told Lucas stories, which classes I didn't tell. Lucas stories are always fun. Always fun to tell a Lucas story. Everyone knew he was going to get the Nobel Prize. He was one of the giants, like really revolutionized macroeconomics, monetary policy thinking, and all of that kind of thing. Everyone knew he was going to get the Nobel Prize. And so when he was getting a divorce, a very, very messy divorce, his ex-wife demanded in the divorce settlement that if you get the Nobel Prize within 10 years, I get half the money. And just at 10 years, he got the Nobel Prize, and she got half the money. He says, the deal's the deal. What can you do? She's my hero. Like, she's amazing. Because, normally you get your divorces, and, he was cheating, and the whole thing was nasty. And normally you think, this person is just awful in every way. But she said, he's awful in every way, but he is clever. And yeah, I don't know if he's awful in every way, but certainly he is clever. And she was aware of it, so awesome. Okay, anyway, she has half the money. But the Lucas critique is a very general thing. And it's a statement about how we should understand empirical work. It's normally talked about in terms of macroeconomics, but it is not specific to macroeconomics. It's talked about in terms of macroeconomics because, of course, Lucas is a macroeconomist, but it's true pretty much of any social science, and even a lot of things like animal behavior and such. But we're going to just talk about economics and social sciences in general. And the thing is, you go out and you look at the data, right? You go find some data, 100 years of wages and inflation, whatever your data is. You go out and find it. And this is data about people and how they're behaving. Right? They're going off, they're living their life in the real world. They don't care about your problem as an economist trying to measure anything. They're just living their life, doing the best they can. Right? And they're living their life in a particular environment. And in particular, they're living a life in a particular policy environment. So the laws are what they are, and people just have to suck it up and deal with it, right? No one wants to pay taxes, but there's taxes, and we just have to deal with the fact that there's taxes, right? And we live our life accordingly. What can you do? There's taxes, right? And so this data is information on how people live their life in that policy environment, right? Which is great. And you run your regressions and you get your Phillips curve and everything's grand, right? Here are. But when people were behaving, these policies influenced their behavior. But why do we want to do these measurements anyway? Well, we want to do these. We want to, well, obviously we want to like get out of university. We want to get tenure. We want to, put food on the table. But on a larger sense, what we want to do is we want to try to make the world a better place. If we can understand where delinquent children come from, we understand what conditions lead to delinquent children that get in trouble with the law, and we understand that, maybe we can do something to make it better, right? If we understand why kids learn in school and why they don't, maybe we can change our behavior so that they do better. If we can understand inflation and unemployment, maybe we can change things so we can lower unemployment. We hope that all this data about the real world is going to help us to make the real world better, right? Ideally, right? This is what we would like. And so it's very tempting. We run our regressions, we get our data, we get our little Phillips curve or whatever empirical relationship we have. And it's very tempting to say, okay, now we know how the real world works, because this was data from the real world. Now we know how it works. Let's change stuff so that we can make it better. And that's glorious and wonderful. But all this data was based on a particular policy environment. All this data was based on people behaving as they were because that's the world they lived in and they just dealt with that. When we change the world they live in, they're going to change their behavior, right? Which is why our Phillips curve is shifting, right? Because it's a new policy environment and they're taking that into account when they're setting their expected inflation. If we change the school system, kids are going to change their behavior, parents are going to change their behavior, sometimes in ways that we think, sometimes in ways we don't think. This policy environment is going to affect their decisions, and all of our data comes from a particular policy environment. It doesn't come from the new one that we're trying to do, right? And so we cannot necessarily trust that behavior, that data is going to stay the same when we switch to a new policy environment. Okay. So if we change our policy, we are going to potentially, not for sure, but potentially change people's behavior in that environment, and they might behave totally differently than they did before. Okay. Which means empirical work is useless. As a theorist, I want to tell you that. Just don't bother. Well, sadly, it's not useless. We have to do it. But it means that it's not enough to be really good with the numbers. Right? If you're really good with the numbers, you can understand empirically what happened in the past, but you will not be able to be confident that your predictions are going to hold into the future, and particularly if you start to try to change things to make the world a better place, right? And so in this particular example, it's a very extreme example, so it's a nice place to talk about the Lucas critique, because when we started to try to exploit the policy, we started to try to exploit the Phillips curve. We exploited this empirical relationship. All of a sudden, it completely disappeared. Okay. But in general, it's not necessarily the case that it's going to completely disappear, but there is always the potential for the empirical relationship to alter when we change the policy, and we need to take that into account. And so how do we do that? You can't just rely on data. You have to understand why people are behaving that way in the first place. So you can look at the data and say, people are behaving in this weird way. That's something I wish I knew, I wish I understood. Let me work to understand it. That's great, right? But if you don't understand why they're behaving that way, if you don't understand where the data is coming from and why people make those decisions, then you have no idea whether when you change your policy, it's going to still be, what people are going to do in response to that new policy. You'll just have no idea. So theory and empirical work have to go hand in hand. If you just have theory, I personally, as a theorist, I think you're wonderful, you're great, just, yeah. But in principle, you can have a theory that's totally divorced from the real world, right? And has nothing to do with anything in the real world. So a little bit of data is probably helpful to know whether you're just, totally lost or whether you're making any sense at all. But also empirical stuff on its own, you have no idea whether it's going to continue to hold or in what way it's going to change when you change the policy, which is the whole goal of doing it in the first place. And so you need to have an understanding of how people are behaving and why they're behaving that way. And that is just theory, right? You need an understanding of people, which is the theoretical part. So they have to go together in order to be really useful, okay? And that's the Lucas critique. You will never see it applied to anything but macro, but in fact, it is true of anything where we're measuring humans, or time we're measuring something with a brain, right? So we put a cheese for the rat runs one way. If we put peanut butter on the cheese, he's going to do something maybe different, maybe not. We have to understand what's going on in the rat's little brain, right? Anything that has a brain can potentially change its behavior when we change the environment that it's working in, right? And particularly humans are prone to this because, I don't know if you've met any humans. They're not as smart as people say, but they're reasonably bright, and they do change their behavior when things change. Okay? So, yeah. Don't want to belabor it. You can look online, like if you want to read about the Lucas critique, type in Lucas critique. Wikipedia has a nice article. They will only tell you about it in terms of macroeconomics, but it is true generally. Yeah?
Is the Phillips curve still gone in the data now? Like, do you not see that relationship anymore in today's data?
So we interpret it very differently now. And that's the next part of the lecture, is like, how do we want to interpret this now that we accept the Lucas critique? What's going on now? And in particular, people have changed the way they do macroeconomic policy a lot because of this. And they're very concerned with how do we influence people's expectations in a way that they weren't before. And so we're going to spend next, like half the class is going to be talking about these expectations and how that feeds into policy. So today and next time I'll talk a bit about what the Phillips curve looks like, but it's a huge topic, right? It's like modern macroeconomics is that. Yeah.
You could see an application of the Lucas critique in HR and bonus systems.
Mm-hmm.
Once a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a measure.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Now we're programmers. Programmers, they have these systems where they put in all the bugs, they log the bugs, and very famously they said, okay, we want, like, programmers hate to fix the bugs. They like to write new stuff, right? So we're gonna grade them based on how many bugs they fix. And so they started to do that, but of course it is the programmers that put the bugs in the first place. And so that was a very expensive mistake. There were a lot of bugs, but they got fixed really quickly. That doesn't work, right? Because it's people. You have to think what their incentives are. And right. So a lot of things become targets like that. And sort of more seriously, in the Vietnam War, they started counting body bags, right? They say, how many bodies did we got? And all of a sudden, everyone's a Viet Cong, right? We bombed the whole place. Everyone was Viet Cong because that's what they were trying to measure. And so, right, and that didn't work either, right? Okay. So that's the Lucas critique. Super important. I'm not belaboring it just because it is simple. It's deep, but it's quite simple. But it is super important, so you should expect it will show up later in the semester in exam questions and things like that. So if it's just a brief thing. Take a look at Wikipedia or whatever. Be comfortable with it. It's not hard, but it is important. Okay. So I don't want to spend hours on it and make it seem like it's supposed to be hard, because it's not. It's simple, it's straightforward, but super important. Yeah. One thing, like in seminars, when people are presenting their work, any empirical person comes up. A cheap and easy thing to say is, so, does this satisfy the Lucas critique? Like, have you thought about why people are making their decisions? And usually, no, they haven't. We should pay more attention than we do. All right, but we're leaving it behind because we're not doing empirical work here. We are looking at this model. And so we have a situation where people's wage-setting behavior depends on what they think that the central bank is going to do. Are they going to increase the money supply? Aren't they going to increase the money supply? Because if they're increasing the money supply, there's going to be inflation. I better get high wages to deal with that. And firms are willing to give me high wages because there's going to be inflation anyway. Right? And at the same time, though, once we set our wages, that's going to give a Phillips curve. Maybe it's going to be a low Phillips curve with low expected inflation. Maybe it's going to be a high Phillips curve with high expected inflation. And that changes things from the central bank's point of view. Right? If it's really high, maybe they have to have 100% inflation in order to reduce unemployment. But if it's really low, maybe they only need 2% inflation to reduce unemployment. And so it matters a lot for policy what this is. And what the expected inflation is. But the expected inflation depends on what people think the policy is going to be. So these things are jointly determined, the central bank's behavior and the individual wage setter's behavior. Okay? Now, this is a situation where what one guy does, what one guy wants to do depends on what the other guy is doing. And what the other guy wants to do depends on what the first guy wants to do. Now, it's a little simpler than that because there are lots and lots of wage setters. They're all very small, whereas there's one big central bank. But in general, this kind of problem is typically analyzed with what's called game theory. Now, game theory is a class here at UCD, which I think is kind of awesome. I don't teach it, sadly, but it is a good class. People like it. But it is very different from what you've seen in first year. They may have touched on it a bit, but it is different. It is associated with Mr. John Nash, who they wrote the Beautiful Mind movie was about John Nash. So we're going to be looking for what's called a Nash equilibrium. And that just means that whatever the central bank is doing is going to be the best for it. And whatever individuals are doing are going to be best for them given what the central bank is doing. So the central bank is going to take people's behavior as given and just do the best it can. And people are going to take the central bank's behavior as given and do the best they can. Okay? And that seems reasonable, at least to me, because I don't feel like I can really influence the central bank and what it's doing. Like, if I do something, if I ask for higher wages or accept lower wages, I don't really think that changes what the central bank is up to. I just take their behavior as given and do the best I can, right? And there's a little more scope for maybe the central bank to influence us with its announcements and such, which we will talk about extensively later on. But largely, they're making their decisions after our wages are set, and so our decisions really are kind of given. Okay? So whenever we have this situation where one person's best course of action depends on what the other guy is doing, and the other guy's best course of action depends on what the first guy is doing, game theory is sort of the go-to way to analyze that. We typically look for Nash equilibria in this way. Okay? There are other ways, but 99% of the papers would approach it with a game theory point of view. Okay? And you can think, why didn't we see that in first year? So why didn't we see that in principles? You might have seen it a bit in intermediate. I don't know. I did intermediate micro. But the main reason is because we assumed it away. Right? When we were talking about firms, we did this supply and demand thing. Right? And we said every consumer was really, 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 really small. And so individual consumers' decisions didn't matter to the firms at all because he's so small. He's just one guy. Right? And every firm was really, really, really small. And so it didn't matter their decisions either. They're just one guy. or one tiny firm. And so we could ignore all that kind of stuff where I actually care what you do. Because nobody cares what an individual consumer does. Nobody cares what an individual firm does. We only care what they do in bulk, which is why we could do the supply and demand stuff. Okay? But here we have a central bank, and the central bank is clearly large. He's the only one who gets to decide on how much money there is. And so everybody cares what he's up to. Like one guy making a decision, everybody cares. We have a different situation. So rather than use what's sometimes called market clearing equilibrium, that is our supply and demand analysis, we need to do something else to look at how to think about equilibrium in this point of view. An argument can be made that economics is the study of equilibrium more than anything else, if I can go back to there. That is the one tool that economists bring to the table that most other social sciences, and they have it, obviously, everyone uses the same stuff, but economists are more heavily invested in equilibrium than I think any other social science. Political science has it as well, but we're really into equilibrium. Like, it's a fetish kind of thing. It's really kind of creepy. Big into the equilibrium. Okay? So we're going to talk about what does equilibrium look like. And it's going to be where I'm doing the best I can given what you're doing the best that you can given what I'm doing. Okay? Okay. So to do this, we need to say, well, okay, the central bank is going to be doing the best it can given what people are doing. What is the best it can? Well, we need to say what it wants, right? Otherwise, we can't say what the best thing for it is unless we know what it wants. We need to give it a utility function, the same way we gave individuals a utility function. And then we could analyze how much they want to buy and all that stuff. Right? We need to say what they want. Okay? And this is just a way of saying this is the goals of these guys. We're going to do it in math. Not so much here, but in general we do it in math. But it's just saying this is what they care about, and this is how much they care about it. Okay? So we are going to give them a target inflation rate and a target unemployment rate. Okay? That is going to be their goal. Their goal is going to be to get as close to the target inflation rate as possible and as close to the target unemployment rate as possible. Okay? Plausible? It's like, since we only have a graph with inflation and unemployment, like what else can they care about? So they have a target. It's not so deep here, but it's, it's an assumption. Right? They have a target. Importantly, that seems trivial, but it means you don't want to be below the target and you don't want to be above the target, right? Both sides. It's not that you want unemployment to be low, unless you want it to be zero. Okay, that's possible. But of course, there are troubles associated with that, but they want some level of unemployment. And if it gets too low, they're going to be unhappy about that. Presumably, that's because wages are going to be increasing and there's going to be pressure on inflation in the future. Or the firms are going to be unhappy, or we're to get unemployment that low, we need to get criminals in bank teller positions, and it's just creepy and weird. Or we have to force anyway, there's a target out there. It can be zero if you like zero. Okay? And there's a target inflation rate. You should be thinking about this as kind of 2%-ish in reality. Like the European Central Bank has a very explicit 2% inflation rate target. I think their official goal is get unemployment as low as possible, consistent with a 2% inflation target. So 2% inflation target is their main goal, and if they can do any good elsewhere, fine, but 2% is what they're after. And this model is going to tell us why it's like that. Now, it could be zero, that's fine, whatever the target is, but we don't want it too high, and we don't want it too low. Okay? Normally, the thought is that we should have a little bit of inflation because some industries are slowly dying, and some firms are slowly dying, but people have a really hard time accepting lower wages. Wages are sticky downward, and so it means that it's going to cause a lot of strife, a lot of unemployment if we have zero inflation and those people's wages really do need to go down for that firm to survive or that industry to survive. But there's no way for them to go down because people won't put up with it. They'll go on strike and it'll be a mess, right? So if we have a little bit of inflation, that are just, without wage increases, that slowly erodes the real spending power of people's wages, and that just makes that kind of thing less painful for society all around. Okay? 2% inflation is kind of the thought, but you can have a different thought, but that's what modern central banks seem to be targeting these days. Fashions come and go. Okay, and we're going to make an additional assumption that the farther we are away from the target, the more the central bank is concerned about that target, right? So if we have a 2% inflation target and the inflation is 2.1%, they say, that's kind of a bummer. But if it's 20%, they're freaking out. Oh my God, we got to do something about inflation. So the farther we get from the target, the more they care. Okay? So tiny variations around the target, nobody even goes into the office. They just, it's the golden age of TV, they continue watching TV. But if it gets 5% off the target, everyone freaks out and they have an emergency meeting. Okay? All right. And we need one more thing for this particular story to work. And that is that the target unemployment rate is less than the natural rate of unemployment, less than the amount that we would have in normal times. Okay. For this particular story to work that I'm about to tell. Okay. It may or may not be true, but you can think, for example, we have frictional unemployment, we've got structural unemployment, we've got cyclical unemployment, right? You might think that surely they want to get rid of cyclical unemployment, and maybe they want to get rid of some of the frictional unemployment as well, but that's part of the natural rate of unemployment, the frictional unemployment. Okay. You can buy it or you're not, but that's the story. Okay. So our first question is going to be, given that this is the world we live in, is it possible to get our targets? Because remember, the central bank has full control of inflation, so they can surely pick the target inflation if they want to. Can they get on their targets? Well, here I put the natural rate of unemployment. Here's our target rate of unemployment. Notice that it's less. Here's the target rate of inflation. And suppose, so we're looking, is it possible to have an equilibrium where we get to our targets, right? Is that a possible thing? Well, suppose people believe that it is, right? So if it's possible, it must be that people are going to believe it, because if we can get our targets, then we'll always get our targets. So if this is an equilibrium, people are going to expect this equilibrium, right? So suppose that they did. So the basic structure here is there an equilibrium like this? Suppose that there is, and then show a contradiction. So now we know that there can't be. Okay, that's what we're doing. Okay, people with me on the structure of the proof? Okay. Suppose that there is, contradiction, our supposition is wrong. Okay. So our supposition is that we're going to make our targets, and in particular, we're going to make our target rate of inflation. Okay. And that seems plausible because we have full control of inflation through the money supply. Right? Okay. So if that's our expected inflation, we get a Phillips curve. If actual inflation is equal to the target inflation, we're going to be at the natural rate of unemployment. And so here we go. Let's see what's on the next slide. Yeah, the next slide. So here we go. Not on the next slide, sorry. Suppose we're at point A. And now it's the central bank's turn. That people have set their expectations. They've set their wages. Now they're stuck in these short-term contracts. So that is the Phillips curve. And the central bank comes along and it says, okay, I've convinced everyone that we're going to make my inflation target, but now it's my chance to actually pick the money supply. What inflation should I give these people? Okay. One option is to do what I promised. I promised them that we would get to the target rate of inflation. I could do that. I could go to point A. That's on the Phillips curve. But look, I'm way far off from my unemployment target. And I'm really close. I'm exactly on my inflation target. And so we said that the farther away from your target, the more you care about that thing, right? So at this point, I really don't care very much about being a little bit off from my unemployment target, right? Because it's just a little bit. I don't care much when it's just a little bit. But my inflation target, sorry. If I go up a little bit, that's not a big deal to me because I'm just slightly off my target. But it is a big deal to me to reduce unemployment, because at this point, unemployment is way off from my target, so I really care about it a lot. And so what I'm going to do, after people have set their short-run Phillips curve, after they've set their wages, I'm actually going to give them a bit higher inflation, right? I'm not happy about the higher inflation, but I'm delighted that I can reduce unemployment. Okay? And so I'm going to give them something like point B. Okay? We'll be a little more precise about this in a minute. Okay? Put indifference curves and such. Okay? And so if people think that we're going to have the inflation target, then we won't have the inflation target. We'll be above the inflation target. Okay? Now, there's a couple ways that you can think about this. You could think that people are kind of dumb and myopic and think, I'm just going to believe the central bank, like a doofus. You could do that. People are like that. Yeah, you've met people. They can be that way. I know I can. So maybe they did that. But then they got inflation higher than they expected. Eventually, they're going to cop on and they're going to raise their expected inflation, right? And this is kind of what happened in the 70s, right? It started out, yeah, the Phillips curve seemed to work. And then as we increase, as inflation sort of ratcheted up, people say, oh, no, they're not at the low inflation. They're at a higher inflation. They started to build that into their expectations. Okay? And it just ratcheted up. Interestingly, this is an aside, but you know how central bankers are like all in the news these days, like for the last 20 years or so? They're not every day, but when there's a major economic announcement, people like gather around and people are following the central bankers and their announcements and all this stuff. It wasn't always this way. In the 70s, like 77, this is a little bit into this, right? Inflation was high at this point. In the US, President Carter appointed Paul Volcker to be chairman of the US Central Bank. And his thing was, we're just going to get rid of inflation. It doesn't matter what we do, we're just going to do it. And so he made a big announcement. None of the press came. Nobody came. Like it was like a new guy. He's going to announce what he's doing in the central bank, and nobody came. Nobody cared because central bankers weren't important because they didn't have control of the money supply up till then. And then we kind of learned by doing and realized that, yeah, this control of the money supply is an important thing and it can make or break fortunes, and maybe if you want to get rich, it would be good to see what these guys are up to. And so that became a thing, but it wasn't at the very beginning. Okay, so it's going to ratchet up. Okay. So what that means, what is it going to look like? Another way to think about this is that people can do this math in their head, right? They can have this graph in their head and they say, well, if I did think this was the inflation target, then in fact, I wouldn't get that inflation. So I'm never going to expect that in the first place. Okay? The first one, where I sort of cop on as I see it happening, is what we're going to call adaptive expectations. My expectations of the future are adapted from what's gone before. And the other one is called rational expectations, which is that the people in the economy know everything that us, the economists, know. They're not stupider than us. They know everything we know. And so they know the model too. And so they can just go right to the right solution. Okay? We're going to talk quite a lot about this going forward. Right. So what does equilibrium look like? Okay, so this can't be an equilibrium, right? You should convince yourself that this can't be an equilibrium. Point A can't be an equilibrium. And point B can't be an equilibrium either, because if inflation was this high, then people would change their expectations, right? It might happen for a year or two, but it's not going to go on and on and on like that, right? So what does equilibrium look like? Well, in the long run, it's got to be that people are getting the inflation they expect, right? Because otherwise they're going to change their expectations. Right? Since nothing is changing in this economy other than the price level, the only, if inflation is always higher than what I expected, I'm going to raise my expectations. And if inflation is always lower than what I expect, I'm going to lower my expectations. And we're going to keep doing this until someday, in the distant future, or maybe right away, expectations are what we're getting, right? Which means that in the long run, we have got to be at the natural rate of unemployment, right? Because if you get the inflation you expect, we get the natural rate of unemployment. Everything is normal, and so we get the normal rate of unemployment. So in the long run, in equilibrium, we have to be at U star. But it can't be point A, because if it was point A, the central bank would trick us, because the benefit of reducing unemployment is so big compared to the cost of raising inflation, right? Because we're far off from our inflation target. So it must be the case that inflation is at so high that the cost of raising inflation is just balancing out the benefit of lowering unemployment. So I'm not willing to make that trade-off. So my inflation costs must be so high that it balances off my unemployment costs, so that I'm not willing to raise inflation higher. Okay. And so there's going to be something like point C, where we have expected inflation, and there, if I increase inflation, which I can do, it's really costly because I'm far off from my target. But the benefit is that I reduce unemployment, and I'm far off from my unemployment target as well. So we're going to get what's called an inflation bias, that in long-run equilibrium, we are going to have inflation higher than our target rate, and we're still going to have the natural rate of unemployment. So we've achieved nothing. Bravo to modern macroeconomics. We've achieved nothing. Yay! Are you proud to be an economist now? Yeah. What have we done? We said, let's go off the gold standard. In the gold standard, we could have very low inflation and natural rate of unemployment. Right? If we just didn't print any money, we'd have zero inflation, and we'd have the natural rate of unemployment. Right? Now, we have control over the money supply. So we have discretion over how much money to print. We still have the same natural rate of unemployment, but now we've got all this inflation. We've got this inflation bias. And so this having discretion about monetary policy, being able to choose the amount of money that you want in the economy, gives you extra inflation at no benefit whatsoever. We've gained nothing, and we have this extra inflation. Sorry, what can you do? Okay. Now, you still might want to do this for reasons outside of this model, right? You might want to be using money supply to smooth out business cycles. We don't have business cycles going on here, right? So it's not that this says that flexible monetary policy is bad. It's saying flexible monetary policy has a cost. It will result in increased inflation just because you have discretion and over and above your target level of inflation. Okay. And so a lot of what's gone on in the last since 1990, but in the 2000s particularly, has been how to deal with this problem, how to get this inflation bias as low as possible. What can we do as policymakers to try to deal with this problem? Okay, so that's a first pass. How are we doing? Yeah, so we have 5 minutes or so. So I'm going to start doing a sort of a deeper look, and that is to sort of see how this actually works. And that's that's kind of what's in our book as well. Also in last year's book, this is what's covered in the book. And to do this, we're going to do what we've done always when we want to sort of take a deeper look at, say, consumer theory. We start taking a look at the indifference curves, right? If you really want to understand choices, you want to look at the indifference curves to understand the choices. So I'm going to be doing exactly the same thing I just did now, but I'm going to be doing it with indifference curves showing where this stuff comes from. I do this for 2 reasons. I want to do it once that way so that you see it twice, right? So that you get a chance to absorb it 2 different ways. And this is the actual thing. And so we need to do that. Okay. So remember microeconomics. Wine and school books. How did wine and school books work? Well, suppose I wanted to do a study on indifference curves. Right? And I said, what I need, and the way we do studies nowadays, we do experimental work, we use students, victims we call them. No, students, we call them, I get confused. We call them students, but they are victims. And what we do is we invite them over to, I'm doing a study on indifference curves, and I'm going to invite you over to my house. Okay? And I've gotten the grant money, and the grant money bought me 50 bottles of wine. And you say, oh my God, I have a creepy weirdo professor. He's invited me over to my house. And you think it's fairly dodgy, but you have no idea how dodgy. Because what happens first is you come into the door and you say, who is this creepy weirdo? But I just got my head on indifference curves, and I just want to learn about indifference curves. And so you come in, and you're saying, I want to make it clear that I'm a student, and this is don't be a weirdo. And so you brought your school books with you to show, look, I'm a student, right? And you come into the place, and the first thing I do is I take one of your books, and I put it in the shredder. And there's $100 down the tube for you. Okay? So what have I done? I've done something bad, right? So let's say you come in, and of course you've had a few drinks before you came, because it is a weird thing. So you have a little bit of wine in you, and you got a few school books. And so what I'm doing is I'm decreasing the amount of school books that you have, right? And that makes you sad. And I can see it on your little face. And you go, oh, but how am I going to get through that class? Oh, man, I got no budget for this. I hate UCD. It's crap. It all goes through your mind. But then I see you getting sad. And I don't want to make you sad. I don't. That's not my goal. My goal is to study indifference curves. And so what I do is I do something nice for you. I hand you a glass of wine. And now I pour into it. I pour into it, and I watch your face. And I just pour in enough so you go back to the happiness that you had before I destroyed your school books. Right? This is how indifference curves work. Right? So I did something nasty. I took away your school book. And then I did something nice. I gave you wine. Okay? And that traces out the indifference curve. At 2 points, that give you the same happiness. Right? And then it gets flatter and flatter and flatter, because you're drunker and drunker and drunker, and you start thinking maybe I shouldn't have any more anyway. And so the wine isn't doing the trick anymore, and you're down to like the important books. And so it gets flatter and flatter and flatter, right? And the farther we go this way, you got books that you're never going to read, but you're so sober, it's really sad. And so it's steeper, right? Okay, that's indifference curves, yeah.
Is it possible for the indifference curve to touch the line?
It is. It is. So we draw it this way, just sort of as for most of the time, most of the stuff. But anything is possible, because it's just what we like, right? It is possible that after a certain amount of wine, you just don't want any more. Okay, I have to let you go, don't I? I hear it in the crowd. Yes, okay, I'll let you go, and we'll do different indifference curves next time.